for all of our listeners, we have Bart Sibrel on. He's produced a couple of films that Chuck's going to name off in a second, but he's calling in, and we're going to go ahead and talk to him about all his beliefs and theories on the lunar landings and what really happened there. And go ahead and read that off, Chuck.
And we're talking about the black area again. And Mr. Sibrel, thank you for being with us as well. My name is Chuck. And we have Bart Sibrel, of course, like we mentioned here, and he is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and investigative journalist who has been producing movies and television programs for 30 years. During this time, he has owned 5 production companies, been employed by 2 of the 3 major networks, and produced films shown on ABC, NBC, CNN, TLC, USA, BET, as well as The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. To discuss these films, he has appeared and been interviewed on The Daily Show, Geraldo, NBC, CNN, Fox, Tech TV, and from Coast to Coast. I guess that's...
Coast to Coast AM.
Okay, forgive me there. And The Abrams Report. Articles featuring Mr. Sibrel's films have been published in Time Magazine, USA Today, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The LA Times, and many others. His top awards from the American Motion Pictures Society include Best Cinematography, Best Editing, and Top 10 Director. Mr. Sibrel has also taught about 20 workshops on acting, filmmaking, editing, and writing, privately and for the Screen Actors Guild. In his youth, he brought to the stage several original theatrical productions, hosted a cable television talk show, and appeared as a seasoned actor on the stage himself over 500 times. And Bart Sibrel's films that bring the validity of the landings in dispute are as follows. In 2000, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. 2001, Astronauts Gone Wild, an investigation into the authenticity of the moon landings. Both in 2004, Apollo 11, Monkey Business, False Photography Unedited, and Apollo 11 Post-Flight Press Conference. All of you listen to Devil's Been Talking Radio, please welcome Bart Sibrel.
Woo!
Well, I don't think that after that lengthy introduction, there's not much time to talk. Only about a half minute, right?
Right.
You know, the funny thing is, Mrs. Sibrel, I went on. I think there's an extreme internet bias against you because I went online forever looking for all sorts of stuff to just to find out more about you, to tell our listeners, and there was nothing, like absolutely nothing. And I found this actually on your website, and it was the best introduction I could get because all the stuff on there was just all negative press and stuff like that. And I was like, man, I mean, you know, come on, there's got to be something here that I can use that's actually valid, as opposed to, you know, everybody, they would, oh man, this guy totally thinks we didn't go to the moon, and here how he's wrong, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, there was absolutely nothing on Google. I mean, nothing. I was actually very surprised.
Well, we live in a time where lies are believed to be the truth, and the truth is believed to be a lie. And unfortunately, that's the state of the world. We have people complaining about fake news who themselves are more expert at fake news than anybody else. So it's really remarkable. And in regard to the moon landings, it's probably the only conspiracy done which really was positive. I mean, whoever shot JFK, whether it was the Russians or Oswald or the CIA, he's still dead. And whoever did 9/11, whether it was the Saudis or the Iraqis or Cheney, 3,000 people are still dead.
Right.
And the moon landings, though, is a positive lie. It made everyone feel good. And, you know, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, we're playing Pittsburgh. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know you were on the team. It's like, oh, well, you know, not we, but yeah, that's the way that people think. We are playing in the Super Bowl, even though they're not on the field, they're not in the stadium, they're at home. But somehow they're playing in the Super Bowl, and even though one single member is not even from their own state, which is what the team is named after. And so people said, we went to the moon. And so you're trying to take that away from them as if you're telling them their team that won the Super Bowl did so by cheating. Even if it's true, they don't want to know about it. It's very simple. If it were possible to go to the moon with 1960s technology, you have to understand a smartphone has 1 million times the computing power than all of NASA had when they allegedly went to the moon. So if they could go to the moon with 1960s technology, which is 1 millionth as sophisticated as a smartphone, if they could do that on their first attempt with 5 decades older technology, there would be bases there by now. Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927. If I said, well, 50 years later, no one has still duplicated that event of flying over the Atlantic since 1927, that would be illogical. There are millions and millions of aircraft built, and millions and hundreds of millions of times they've flown over the Atlantic since then. So to say they could go to the moon on the very first attempt with 1960s technology, but it cannot be repeated today, simply defies logic. And even though it defies logic, people's emotions are tied into this. I talked to a professor at a university, and I asked him if he saw Buzz Aldrin confess on national TV that the moon landings were fake, would he then accept it? And he says, no, I would still think that they went.
Yeah, that's insanity.
Isn't that amazing? And this guy is a professor teaching college at a major university, and he says he would disregard the person who was there at the time and still believe that they went anyway. Isn't that amazing? And that's what we're up against. So no wonder why when someone, tells the truth that people don't want to hear, they're persecuted. This has been going on for thousands of years. That's why I say kill the messenger. It's this latest thing going on is that the Russians helped Trump win. Well, even if they did, the only way that they did it was by leaking out facts about Hillary Clinton. You see what I'm saying? So what they're really saying is the truth helped Trump win the election, which means it was Hillary Clinton's disreputable behavior and the DNC's disreputable behavior that helped Trump win the election. They blame it on the Russians, but even if the Russians released the information through Assange, through WikiLeaks, all that's in the information is simply the truth. So what the current administration is saying is we do not want the truth to be known, otherwise it might influence the election in a way where honest people might accidentally win.
Yeah, as you said, we're in a society now where people, they don't want to hear, they're so committed to something that anything opposed to that point of view is going to be completely persecuted just because of the fact that's something they don't want to hear. And then, of course, they want to whenever the truth comes out about a particular candidate or just whatever in general, if it's to their benefit, then it's pretty convenient. And then that's when they want to accept it and use it for their own bias. So I wanted to
go ahead.
Ask you a question, just because the fact that I've heard you on a couple of different podcasts, and so it was just questions of interest to me. But I wanted to ask you, just so that our audience can get to know you a little better, when did you decide that the lunar landings were fake, and what started you on this journey towards exposing the whole hoax of the lunar landings themselves?
Well, I used to think they were real. In fact, I was the biggest fan of the moon missions that I knew. I had about 20 pictures, color pictures, on my wall from the age of 4 to 14. No matter where I moved, there they were on my wall. I was the biggest fan. I thought it was the greatest thing, marvelous, magical, whatever. And then when I was 14 years old, I saw on a national television program a gentleman who worked for NASA during the time of Apollo who said he read an interdepartmental memo that said the odds of them reaching the moon without killing the crew and returning them safely was estimated to be 1 in 10,000.
Wait, what year was this? What year was this that you heard that?
I believe that would have been 69, 79. I guess it would have been about 1985, something like that, maybe a little bit before, maybe 1980, something like that.
So this whole idea isn't like a new thing then?
Well, it's fairly new in that I spent a good portion of my life believing that the moon landings are real. So when I basically just started pondering about the moon landings potentially being false around the age of 14. Then when I was 24, 10 years later, after at least entertaining the idea that they might be false, I had become a filmmaker and was working on a film for the gentleman who had produced a TV show I'd seen 10 years earlier as a 14-year-old. And I asked him, well, who was that guy who said we didn't go to the moon? And I tracked him down, and he suggested that I do a film about it. And I took about 6 months off, did research into the photography anomalies. There's several that are pretty noticeable. I mean, if these pictures that they claim were lit by sunlight on the moon, as there's no atmosphere there, so according to NASA, the sunlight is 10 times brighter than a desert on Earth, there's no need for electrical lighting when you have such bright lighting. And yet, in several of the pictures, the astronaut shadows, let's say from one astronaut to another, or from an astronaut to a rock or whatever, they run in divergent angles. They're not parallel. I mean, if you go out with your friend and stand on a sunny, cloudless day out in the yard, you'll see that your shadows will always run parallel with one another. They will never intersect. And in some of these pictures, and you can see this, just your listeners can go to Sibrel, Sibrel.com, and then click on the YouTube link and then go down to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. They can see the film in which there's objects about 3 feet apart from one another where the shadows are going at 90 degrees different angle. This is simply impossible to be done with sunlight. It means that this was being shot with an electrical light that was very close. So when one object was to the left of the light, it caused the shadow to go in one direction. And when another object was to the right of the electrical light, it caused it to go in a different direction. I mean, this is proof in itself that these pictures were not taken on the moon. And then if you look at the video image, that was what most people saw in 1969 of this little grainy, snowy image of the astronaut floating around at alleged 1/6 gravity, it looks convincing until you double the speed and you realize they're only getting off the ground an inch, and it's so obvious. They're using slow motion to simulate, the lesser gravity. And then it just goes on, and then, 2 of the 3 astronauts won't give any interviews. The administrator of NASA resigned days before the first mission. And of course, this event cannot be repeated. Technology does not go backwards, right? Lindbergh doesn't fly across the Atlantic in 1927, and then 50 years later, people can't even get off the ground in an airplane. No, it's the other way around. So what they're saying is that we went to the moon with 1960s technology, a millionth of the computing power as a smartphone on the first attempt, which is 1,000 times farther than the space station is today. And we went there and back on the first attempt 50 years ago, but somehow we can't repeat it for another 20 years or 70 years after the first time. That's the earliest projection of, quote, returning to the moon is 70 years after allegedly doing it the first time on the first attempt. There's never even been an aircraft in the entire history of aviation that got off the ground on the first attempt, not a single time. The 747. They went through 162 engines before they found one that could lift that fuselage off the ground. And we're to say a mission that's at least 100 times more complicated than going up to the space station. They did it on the very first attempt, and it had never previously been done. That's completely illogical also. And so it just, I don't know, how long is it going to take? 1,000 years before, we return to the moon, before people realize that they didn't do it the first time? It's pretty sad. I don't know what to say. It's simply the truth. If it were so easy to go, in 1960s, there would be bases there by now. China would have gone, Israel would have gone, England would have gone. It's just ridiculous to think that they could do it way back then, but they can't do it today.
Yeah, people think I'm kind of crazy because I've been telling people, because I was actually excited to do this interview, and so they were asking me, wait, who's this guy that you're interviewing? And I was telling them about all that. But that was that was actually something they'd be like, wait, why would you believe that? And that was actually kind of the nail in the coffin for me is, number one, if we did it, how come we haven't repeated it? And then number two, how come other nations haven't done it? And number three, how come we don't have bases on the moon? Number four, how did we do it with a cell phone, with a technology that isn't even as advanced as our modern day cell phone? I mean, it's just kind of the weight against the, the ability for us to actually do it. As you said, the first time, the very, very, very first time, to me, is honestly just lunacy to actually think that we could do that, because we haven't done it as you've brought up and very well stated, we haven't done it with any other technology, not the computer, not the Wright brothers' first plane, nothing like that. It's but we go to the moon the first time. I mean, that to me is pretty impossible in my mind.
All you have to do is, just look at history. Every time a century goes by, or even a decade goes by, mankind is able to physically travel greater distances, right? First, we traveled, from Spain to the United States. Then once we were here, we traveled, west. Then they went to the South Pole. The South Pole has nearly 100 mile per hour winds at minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet there are bases there because it's humanly possible. If it were humanly possible to go to the moon, there would be bases there by now, right? The space station, which is the farthest we can go today, 50 years later, it's only 200 miles above the Earth, 225 miles above the Earth. So just pick a destination 225 miles away from where you are, flip it up vertically, and that's as high as any man can go today. And yet they're saying, well, wait a minute, 50 years ago on the very first attempt, they went 250,000 miles away when they can only do 200 miles today? That doesn't make any sense. That's like saying, we broke the sound barrier 50 years ago, but unfortunately we can't do it today. What would you believe if someone said that? We broke the sound barrier 50 years ago, but it cannot be repeated today. Well, I would think, they must have lied about it. That's the only logical explanation. And that's the only logical explanation now. They lied about it.
It's a very good question. And on that, it seems like you have kind of a lot of crap for trying to expose the lunar landings. What is it in... what is in it for you to pursue this path, and what exactly are you looking for in all of this on that?
Well, it's like having a cure for cancer, and you find out that the medical industry is suppressing it because they make more money off of the suffering and misery of people. If that were true, wouldn't you want to do something about it? Wouldn't you want people to know the cure for cancer? And everyone would say, no, all these multi-billion-dollar medical organizations, if they had a cure, they would tell you. Well, that's not necessarily true. And the same thing here. Here we have this very important moment in history. Let's just say they could go to the moon. Let's say they physically could reach the moon, plant a flag, and come back. That would have a certain level of significance historically to mankind. But if they couldn't go, they lied about it, they murdered people to keep it a secret, they embezzled billions of dollars, that's actually more profound of an event historically than if they had actually gone. And now we know that this is true. And so what we have is this great moment in history, the faking of the moon landing and the corruption of the United States government to such a degree, and yet that truth is being withheld from mankind. And if a bank robber steals $1 million and gets away with it, he's just going to steal $2 million the next time. And if he gets away with that, he's going to steal $4 million. So the United States government got away with this. And if you keep letting them get away with it, they're just going to be emboldened to do worse and worse things. That's why the truth should come out. That's why I think it's important for mankind to know.
Well, I actually had a question after Chuck asked his, but I think you just answered it. And that was another follow-up question to that was going to be, what does it matter if the government is lying to us about the lunar landings? Why is it so important for us to know? But I think you just kind of answered both of those in one, and just saying that, hey, if they get away with it once, what are they going to do next that they're going to get away with? So I think that's actually a very valid point.
Sure.
That's right. If your spouse is cheating on you, if they don't come clean about it, they're just going to keep cheating on you over and over again with more and more people. And that's the United States government cheating on the citizens, taking their money, saying it was to be spent on going to the moon, squandering it or spending it on projects that weren't approved by Congress or the citizens, Vietnam War in Cambodia, Laos, wherever the money was going, and continuing to lie about it. I mean, 9/11, you have 2,000 architects. Can you imagine if we had 2,000 aerospace engineers saying that the Saturn V rocket and the lunar module was not physically capable of going to the moon? That'd be pretty incredible, wouldn't it? And yet here we have something that took place on Earth, right, in front of hundreds of witnesses. You have 2,000 professional architects and engineers risking their reputations and their future income to go on the record and say there's no way that kerosene fires from jet aircraft could brought that building down. In fact, the guy who built, the World Trade Center said in an interview like 6 weeks beforehand, you could hit the towers with 12 planes and they would still stand. It'd be like throwing a pencil through a screen door would be the effect on it. They've gone on the record and saying that explosives were set. Okay, so we have 2,000 people. Just imagine 2,000 engineers who said the Saturn V, the lunar module, wouldn't work, for example. And yet, what's being done about it? Nothing. Nothing is being done about it. The media is not media. It's propaganda. It's owned by the people who faked the moon landing, whoever they are. It's owned by the people who perpetrated 9/11. So the last thing they're going to do is expose their own crimes. What we have, out there on TV, it's not news. It's all propaganda, 100% of it. They're the ones who have the facts and they refuse to pursue it. I think that's a pretty substantial news story. 2,000 engineers saying that the buildings were brought down with explosives, and yet no one does about it. No one's interested in finding the perpetrator of 3,000 homicides. 3,000 homicides? And no one wants to solve that problem. And so what is the moon landing compared to that happened, 50 years earlier? This is just the cesspool that we live in, and it's pathetic that these people who, that are gaga people, worship false idols. Look at all these great political leaders who, people respected who ended up being pedophiles. And you have these astronauts who are complete liars. Their whole careers based on a lie. They get congressional medals of honor, ticker tape parades for them. And those are our nation's heroes. And then when you try to point out the fact that they're a bunch of scoundrels, then they treat you the way the scoundrels should be treated. That's the upside down world that we live in.
All right. And with all this in mind, I wanted to go over a few of the points you bring up in the videos, starting with a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. First question being, the first thing I wanted to ask is about the importance of the space race between America and Russia. What kind of an impact do you think that had on the American side of the race?
Well, the media was kind of hyping the space race in order to gain financing for it. The Soviets launched the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, the first of 2 spacecraft simultaneously. For every 100 hours we spent in space, they spent 500 hours. If anyone could have gone to the moon, it would have been the Russians, but they never did it. And so if you're playing poker and you've got 2 2s, and the person you're playing has 3 3s, you go all in. And that's really what the moon landing fraud was. It was a bluff. And it's been done dozens and more times during war. Fake aircraft, fake landing fields, fake battalions that didn't exist to, mislead the enemy. Also, you had Richard Nixon, president at the time. Remember, he was a felon. He was a convicted felon.
Well,
and that's the guy. That's the guy who was in charge during the moon landings, a convicted felon. Right? Huh. And so, people realize when they defend the moon landings, they're defending a convicted felon.
So what president. Was he a convicted felon of?
I think it was conspiracy to withhold information, not acting upon subpoenas and things like that. He had to be pardoned by Gerald Ford of all crimes that he had done. And that, of course, that's why Ford didn't get reelected, because he pardoned, the criminal president. But the point is, that's the only time we've had a, criminally indicted president. That was the one who was at the helm during the faking of the moon landings. And also had the Vietnam War going on. And in Nixon's mind, he said the number one threat, remember, Obama says the number one threat to America is ISIS. Trump says the number one threat to America is nuclear weapons. And Nixon said the number one threat to America are domestic anti-war protesters. Oh. That's their number one threat. And people expressing, his own citizens expressing their freedom of speech, freedom to assembly, protesting his warmongering decisions, that was what was his biggest threat in his mind. So you have now the opportunity to have a pep rally, to have a game played in which the fix is in. There's no way you could lose. Either you risk killing these people, these astronauts from the first crew to the moon, on live television, international television. You risk killing them. Or you fake it, and you can absolutely guarantee 100 success rate that the moon missions will at least come across as being successful. So during this time of the Vietnam War and all those protests and all the negativity about America, you had everyone waving their flag and crying, "Isn't America great? We put a man on the moon." And again, you're trying to take that away from somebody. They really don't want to give it up. Now that we have people, a new generation who weren't alive at the time, who didn't have that, false imprinting on their brains, they can look at it more objectively and see, there's no way that they could have been true. If they were true, there would be bases there by now. It's pretty simple, really, if you think about it. The only reason people believe moon landings are real is simply because they've been deceived. Does Copperfield really levitate an elephant? Did he really make the statue of Liberty disappear? No, of course not. It was an illusion. And so was opening men on the moon. And of course, a funny thing happened on the way on the moon. The moon covered, and Ford seeing concrete proof for 100% of them faking a shot right in front of your eyes, pretending to be halfway to the moon, creating a 1-foot model of the Earth in the spacecraft's in-Earth orbit, with a third track of audio of the CIA prompting them to speak only after 4 seconds have gone by, so that they won't give away the fact that they're real close to the Earth instead of far away, like they'd like people to believe. We have this concrete proof. 4 out of 5 people who see it reverse their opinion as to the authenticity of the moon missions. Prior to this footage, it's a theory. With this footage showcased in the film, it's a fact. There's it's just an absolute fact they didn't go. I was giving them the benefit of the doubt during this $500,000 5-year project. I said they probably did go, but there's at least a 1 out of 4 chance they didn't. And 3.5 years into it, I find this classified footage. You pop in the tape. It says on the screen, "Do not show to the public," in big letters. There's a third track of audio. It's not NASA. It's not the astronauts. It's a CIA asking the astronauts not to speak until 4 seconds have gone by. They hear a question from NASA, but they're only up in 200-mile Earth orbit, even though they claim they're halfway to the moon, which they're not. And so someone counts off 4 seconds and then says, "Talk." Don't speak until 4 seconds have gone by, to create the fake radio delay as if you're further away from the Earth than you really were. All this is proven with the Orion spacecraft sent up 2 years ago this month. They sent a spacecraft up that went farther than any spacecraft has gone since Apollo. It went 3,600 miles up, did a U-turn, and came back. Well, what's at 3,600 miles? The Van Allen radiation belt. That's why the space station is at 225 miles, because if it goes any higher, it's subjected to lethal radiation that starts at about 1,000 miles up. It's about 30,000 miles thick, and that's what this Orion spacecraft went into, unmanned, with Geiger counters, right? So they have 2 different sets of Geiger counters. They go up into the radiation belts, which you'd have to go through to reach the moon. In fact, it's the only time in human history humans are said to have gone through this radiation belt, which is to the moon and back. This is one of the reasons why they faked it. They could not go through the radiation, which the tape we found proves, of them faking being halfway to the moon, proving they never left Earth orbit. I contacted NASA. I said, "Why don't you tell me these Geiger counter readings in the radiation belt?" They said that information's classified. I said, wait a minute, the temperature of the sun, that's not classified information. How much helium is in Jupiter's atmosphere, that's not classified. So why would the amount of radiation in this magnetic field surrounding the Earth, why would that be classified? Well, the reason is because if they tell you, it'll prove the astronauts couldn't survive going through it. In fact, their spokesperson, Kelly Smith, said this. He said, it is a dangerous field of radiation, and we must first learn how to protect astronauts from it before we send people through it. Wait a minute. He said the technology does not yet exist to protect astronauts from the radiation field that the Apollo crews said they went through to the moon and back 18 times. And NASA indirectly just admitted that the moon landings were fake.
So how do you come across footage and audio tape with them reading off and counting? Because I know you have that in your actual in the video that you have. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. I believe you also in Astronauts Gone Wild kind of questioned some of the astronauts about that. What did you just wake up and there was a classified envelope in your mailbox that said for Bart Sibrel with no name and no address on it? How do you come across that? I would imagine it would be pretty hard to get a hold of, especially if it's from NASA and it's classified.
Well, we had a budget of $500,000, and part of that budget was spent buying documentation from unnamed sources who were former NASA employees or relatives of former NASA employees. We would spend $10,000 on one paper document to get classified information. And part of that information that we got was a reel of footage, unedited. It's the only unedited footage, that and one other reel of the entire mission. No unedited reels are available to the public except these that we've got. And on this, we have them doing this fake shot, of which they only aired about 10 to 20 seconds of. And we have the outtakes of them doing this, fake shot over and over again, talking about how they're faking it, the third channel of the CIA audio on there. And it absolutely proves that they never left Earth orbit. What a surprise. 50 years after they allegedly went to the moon, the highest altitude they can get is 225 miles. And what a surprise. It's exactly as far as they actually got 50 years ago, because we have them pretending to be halfway to the moon from Earth orbit. So if you could really go halfway to the moon, you wouldn't be faking being halfway to the moon. So it means they couldn't leave Earth orbit because they're still in Earth orbit when they're faking the shot, claiming to be halfway to the moon. And it's absolutely astounding when you see it. People just, their hearts melt. They stop. They skip a beat. I showed it to the news director at NBC. He says, "Oh my God, it looks like we didn't go to the moon." I said, "Yeah, what do we do?" He says, "I cannot air this. It will cause a civil war." So the news director at NBC agreed that this tape proved that the Apollo moon missions were fraudulent, and he refused to broadcast it for fear of the consequences.
All right. Second thing I would like to ask is about the research done by Van Allen and von Braun. Do you think that maybe their original research was wrong and that they corrected it?
Well, you have to go back and find what the original research is. Right. If you go to Sibrel, Sibrel.com, then go down to Conspiracy Corner link, then go down to the article, Did We Walk on the Moon 47 Years Ago? You can find the original findings of Van Allen, who the belts were named after, from a 1957 article of Scientific American. And he says that the belts are 10 to 100 times that of a lethal dose. They're at least 10 times a lethal dose, up to 100 times a lethal dose.
So either way, you're dead.
I'm sorry?
So either way, you're dead.
If you went through them, that's correct. Yeah, you'd have to go through them if you're launching near the equator, which is what they did. They launched from southern Florida, and they claimed they went through the belts and that there was simply no radiation there. Oddly enough, when the space shuttle went to its highest altitude, like 365 miles, and I think it was 1996 or 94, somewhere around then, they said they could see the radiation from more than 700 miles away with their eyes closed as sparks of light like fireworks with their eyes closed. They descended to a lower altitude because of the danger, and then CNN reported this word for word. The radiation belt surrounding Earth is more dangerous than previously believed. Okay? They report this in 1994 when the space shuttle goes to its highest altitude, more than 700 miles away from the beginning of a 30,000-mile radiation field that a space shuttle crew has never gone through, but the Apollo crews claim to have gone through. And then they say the radiation belt is more dangerous than previously believed. Well, what is previously believed? That's going to the moon. So how is it that a space shuttle crew more than 700 miles away from the beginning of the belts would know more about it than the Apollo astronauts who allegedly went through it? There's only one way. Allegedly means they really did not. And they actually got closer to the belts than the Apollo astronauts did, who only went up to about 200 miles. So they went to 365 miles. And so that's why they reported they're more dangerous than previously believed. And then 2 years ago, again, Kelly Smith from NASA says the radiation belts are dangerous radiation, and we must first learn how to protect astronauts from it before we send people through it. He admits that the technology does not yet exist to protect the astronauts from the radiation. That's why they didn't put men on board the spacecraft, right? Spacecraft went up and came back fine. The fact is, you can X-ray a toaster 1,000 times, it'll still make toast. But if you X-ray a human being 1,000 times, you're going to have trouble. And that's why the Geiger counter readings were classified. There's no reason for technical information about nature, temperature of the sun, the amount of helium in Jupiter's atmosphere, or the amount of radiation in the magnetic field surrounding the Earth. There's no reason at all for that reading of nature to be classified, unless the disclosure of it would prove that the moon landings are fake, and that's what happens to be the case.
You keep saying that they've only been out about 225 miles, and it's from that vantage point, at least on the a funny thing happened on the way to the moon video. That was where they actually shot those fake photos that you said that you got the reel from. Could you talk to us a little bit about that photographic evidence that you had obtained? And you also went into some photographic evidence on the actual lunar landings themselves. Part of it was the intersecting shadows, and then you had some other things that you went into. Could you talk about a little bit about that for our listeners to hear, for those who might not have actually been familiar with your videos?
Yeah, and I don't know if you're going to show video clips. If you are, you could certainly show them in lieu of this description. And if you only use audio, you can show the very beginning of that segment. It's listed there in the article. It starts off with, Goldstone says the TV picture looks great. Then there's exactly 4 seconds of dead air. You hear a third track of audio, someone crystal clear say, talk. And then Neil Armstrong starts speaking. It's obviously not NASA. It's not the astronauts. It's this third party without any radio EQ. It's crystal clear. They're at the source where this tape is being recorded, wherever that is. And basically, Neil Armstrong heard NASA, its question immediately. But if he responded immediately, that would have given away that the fact that he's close to Earth. If he's supposed to be halfway to the moon, that's about 1.5 seconds, 2 seconds out to receive the question at light speed and a couple of seconds back, in order to respond to it. So there should have been about a 4-second delay, at least, between asking a question and hearing the answer. So in order to, make sure he didn't give away the fact that he's close to Earth by responding immediately, which he could have, he had an earpiece in. Someone from the CIA or whoever counted off 4 seconds, which is exactly the amount of time that went by after NASA asked the first question. And then you hear this clandestine third party say, talk. And then Neil Armstrong is then given permission to answer the question after the 4-second delay to give the effect that he's further away from the Earth than he really was.
And you had asked, excuse me here, my throat keeps getting stuff on there, but you asked us to check out an article on thesleuthjournal.com, and so I wanted to read a couple of quotes that are on that article right at the beginning of it, and ask what they mean pertaining to the lunar landings. One of them by, of course, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Schopenhauer. It says, all truth passes through 3 stages. First being, it is ridiculed. Then, it is violently opposed. Finally, it is accepted as self-evident. And the second quote on this is also by George Orwell. There's 2 of them here. In the age of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And whoever controls the past controls the future. Next one is, one of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. And that's from Carl Sagan. Last one would be from Mark Twain. It is easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. So
yeah, well, that's because of people's pride. You know, the college professor has been teaching his whole life that the moon missions are real. So in order for him to see the truth, he has to admit that he was wrong. That's why it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. And the very wise Mark Twain said that. And then the previous quote was from Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan said this, implying he was talking about the moon missions. He was coming very close, I believe, to going on the record by saying that the moon missions were fake prior to his death in the late 70s. He said one of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled or fooled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle, which is what I'm trying to do. People are rejecting the evidence that they have been deceived. It says people are no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle or the lie has captured them because it is simply too painful to acknowledge that they have been taken. You know, and that's simply a fact. It has to do with the way that people are wired emotionally. And then George Orwell, he said, you know, in an age of universal deceit, which is the age we live in now, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. All I'm saying is that I believe that the government lied about the moon missions. And yet I get hate email from people who say they wish they could watch me and my family be burned alive in front of them.
That sounds like something American to do.
Right.
Now, here's the thing. If you believe turmeric is the most medicinal spice, and I believe garlic is the most medicinal spice, if I'm going to say, well, I wish that you would, you know, I could see you shot in the head and chopped into little pieces because I disagree with you. So the fact is, people are so rabid mentally about this, that itself proves their deception. There's another quote that's not in here. It says, the likelihood of one individual being right increases in direct proportion to the intensity to which others are trying to prove him wrong. The fact that I get these, you know, raving lunatics threatening to kill me, wishing I would die, calling me vulgar expletives, is all the more proof that I'm right, because it just proves that they are crazy. And how could someone who's crazy perceive the truth?
Is there? I'm listening to you, and one thing I can definitely tell is you're definitely passionate about this, and that's good. I mean, that's awesome. If you're going to do something like this, I mean, be passionate about it. Don't be half-hearted. Is there anything else besides the lunar landings that you're just as passionate about, that you're investing your full energies in, just like you're doing with the faked lunar landings?
Yeah, I would say more so working out my own salvation with fear and trembling, you know, because I follow alternate news a lot. I do a weekly broadcast on YouTube called Conspiracy Corner, and it talks about, you know, chemtrails or fluoridation or whatever. And in order to do this show, I do, you know, lots of every day I'm doing research. And it seems like a lot of it is political, you know, Trump, anti-Trump, pro-Trump, anti-Clinton, pro-Clinton, blah, 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 blah. And it really just seems useless. There's a scripture, I think, in Matthew, might be around chapter 15, where Jesus said, you'll be judged for every idle word. And when you really think about it, this whole divide and conquer strategy is working, brilliantly. As long as we can keep the country divided, into two camps, blue and red or whatever you want to call it, then the people will never unite against the true evil people who are up in the government pulling the strings, you see. And so whether Trump is the greatest or the worst president, it won't affect my eternal salvation. And I think that's one of the keys, is that all these colleges in the world, or in the United States in particular, they were all Bible colleges. They were all founded on the Bible. Every single one of them that's more than 100 years old was a Bible college. And yet now, almost 3/4 of the people who go in there as believers come out doubting because they're sold on evolution. Evolution says that a lower form of life created a higher form of life. But that's like saying a kindergarten can teach algebra. I mean, it's if you really think about it, it's the exact opposite of logic. Just like people who believed they could go to the moon with 1/1,000,000th the computing power of an iPhone 50 years ago on the first attempt, but they can't do it today. Somehow, to me, that speaks for itself that it did not happen. And so evolution teaches the exact opposite of logic, that a lower form of being without a brain can create. Look at our human body with the skull and the eyes and the heart and the liver, all departmentalized and yet all working together. And to say that some amoeba came up with that, to me, is illogical. So that means there is a divine creator. Then you have to ask yourself, well, is there a Messiah? Is it Buddha? Is it Muhammad? Is it Jesus? Who is it? And if there's just one universe, I say there's one God. And if there's just one earth, then I'd say there's just one Messiah. Otherwise, God is weak. The reason that gets me to believe that Jesus is the Messiah is he said, love your enemy. Only a spiritual being would say something so preposterous. Right. The alleged Christians, America, we bomb our enemies. The Jews, they bomb their enemies. The Muslims, they bomb their enemies. So no one is truly loving your enemy except a true Christian. And then so everyone's going to die, whether we went to the moon or not. Everyone's going to die, whether Trump is great or Hillary Clinton is great. And so that's really what's more important. And according to the Bible, we live in a fallen world. That's why, there's quotas here, in a lost world, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act. And that's what's going on. You have these WikiLeaks come out about corruption in a political party, and rather that they say, well, the FBI needs to investigate what? The corrupt behavior? No, the person who released the corrupt behavior. I mean, is that not absurd? They're not going out after the FBI is not going after the corrupt behavior that was exposed. They're going after the person who exposed the corrupt behavior, you see? And so that shows that people need to change. They have to go from being corrupt to being pure. Everyone imitates the fallen world around them, and then someone has to make a decision at some point in your life to reverse that, to stop sinning, to start living a righteous life, and then one thing more at a time, I guess, learning day by day. So I'm passionate about making sure I make it into eternity and helping other people do likewise. Because anything less than immortality is a complete waste of time. None of these things of the world, politics, or whether chemtrails is real or the moon landing is fake or whatever, none of that is going to give anybody eternal life. It is an example. I think the moon landings being fake is an example of the depravity of mankind, which goes to illustrate its fallen state, and that, the father of lies is in charge of the world. I think it's beneficial in that way. So if that inspires people to be part of the battle between good and evil, I think that's a good thing. I think everyone needs to repent, read their Bible, and pray to the Lord for eternal salvation.
I am actually really glad you said that, because of the fact that we're a Christian podcast here, but I try to encourage. One of the reasons why I call it Devil's Been Talking Radio is because, just like you were saying, there's a lot of corrupt behavior out there. There's all of our news is essentially propaganda. And so I'm essentially trying to tell people, hey, you know what? The devil is talking all the time. Who are you going to listen to? And it's funny that you went into the whole creation science thing, because actually the guy that I have coming on next week, his name is Pete Greer, and he's actually going to be expounding on 7 ways why creationism defies evolution. And that's going to be really cool to listen to, because I think evolution in itself is just insane proposal to, just like you said, a less intelligent form of life somehow created a higher form of life. I think that's just as preposterous. And as you said, people are going into our universities, believers, coming out evolutionists, because the evolution essentially teaches that there is no God and that life came out of nothing. There was nothing there, and then it exploded. As the old.
But there's
saying
actually
goes.
a deception. There's a deception on the other end as well. There are two great books, Privileged Planet and One Cosmos Under God, that can scientifically prove that even life on Earth should not exist. Statistically, it'd be like winning the Powerball lottery 20 times in a row. And then so the more that science goes on, it actually proves creation to be more true as time and time goes on. And because that is the case, the deceiver has to counter that. Now, Apollo comes from Apollyon, which means the devil or deceiver. And this was called the Apollo missions. And I'm sure you're familiar with ancient aliens.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so truly intelligent people, when you look at you can look at a lizard that's got these suction cups or whatever to crawl on the ceiling. It's obviously a leopard didn't say, hey, if I have spots, I think I'll blend in better. Let me concentrate and give myself spots. Just like the lizard didn't give itself suction cups, you know what I mean? It was designed to do this. Now, the truly smart people who would formerly be atheists are seeing these things come out, and they're just shown in these two books, Privileged Planet and One Cosmos Under God, that things are designed. So the deceiver has countered it and said, yeah, but we were designed from aliens from outer space. There was a project called the Eve Project that took DNA samples from all nationalities, traced them backwards, and we all came from one woman, just like the Bible says. But in order to counter that scientific fact, they say, yeah, but we were planted here by aliens. And I thought this was just a one-time special, but apparently this series has been on for years, saying the same thing over and over again. We were planted by aliens. And yet they don't ask the simple, rudimentary, third-grader question a single time, which is, if we were made by aliens, who made the aliens? And they just never answered that simple question. Now, here's the thing. If the lie is, not only is evolution the lie, the other lie is that life is abundantly everywhere. But these two books prove that life should not even exist on Earth. You see this?
Yeah.
Which means that the only life in the entire universe may be right here and nowhere else. And there's a proof of that in the scriptures. Revelation 21, verse 3, it says that God and the new heaven and new earth will dwell with us personally. Now, we know that the Bible says God is not a respecter of persons, right?
Yeah.
So if there are planets everywhere, right, throughout the universe, and God chooses to live with us in our super fallen state and not with them, that means he's showing partiality. But the Bible says God does not show partiality. So the only way he can live with us and not be impartial is for there not to be anyone else who he could have lived with, that we're it. And that's in Revelation 21:3 when it says that God will personally dwell with us. That means we're it. You see, so if fallen angels and aliens end up being the same thing, because these two guys, and I think one of them I thought Greer was his name, he really promotes the UFO agenda, but maybe it's a different person. These top UFO researchers, I think they've been in the field 30 or 40 years. They were actually kicked out of the UFO community when they both came to the same independent conclusion that UFOs are real, but they're not from outer space. They're from Earth. And if fallen angels are masquerading, right, they've been around for thousands of years, then maybe they do have anti-gravity technology, right? If you imagine if Edison or Einstein lived for 6,000 years. How many would you think they'd come up with zero gravity, or Tesla? They would have probably come up with that in 200 years, right?
Yeah.
So get this, it gets better. So if fallen angels are really aliens, right?
Yeah.
And this TV show, which is propagating, intellectual thought around the world, says that aliens made us. What they're really saying is that fallen angels made us, or Lucifer made us. And that goes back to Isaiah, where it says he wanted to ascend Lucifer to the throne of God and be God. What's the number one best word to describe God? Creator. And now modern day intellectual lying thought is that our creator was an alien, which is really a fallen angel, which is really Lucifer rather than God.
That's actually really interesting. I think, as a matter of fact, one of the guys, you're probably familiar with him, was, I believe he was a French physicist. His name was Jacques Vallée, and he actually he was a big proponent of the whole idea that aliens themselves were extra-dimensional beings as opposed to extraplanetary beings.
That's it. During a lot of these alien abductions, people invoked the name of Jesus, and the aliens ran away. Now, if they're really aliens from outer space, why would the name Buddha, Bart, Jesus, Mohammed mean anything to them? Right? If they're just space creatures. But if they're fallen angels, demonic of that realm.
We got a small issue going on with your connection where it's starting to rattle a whole lot.
It does that for about a minute every 27 minutes.
Okay. All right.
It's a technical glitch I can't solve. It'll ride out. It should have happened 27 minutes ago.
Yeah, it did, and I just started praying a lot.
Amen.
So it should go up in a second. Cut around both of them.
Yeah, we'll have to do that.
Yeah, I tried to track this down. I was in the firmware of the microphone and my operating system, and everybody blames everybody else and can't seem to figure it out. So I should have told you that beforehand.
Oh,
Keep an eye
no,
open.
it's fine. Go on with what you're saying. You're actually sounding pretty clear now.
Well, it gets down to Apollyon. Apollo means deceiver. We know he's the father of lies. What is the greatest accomplishment? That's why I open up the film. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon with the Tower of Babel. The greatest accomplishment up until 200 years ago was architecture. How tall could you make a building without it collapsing on itself? That's why the Tower of Babel, and yet it was never finished. We showed the Titanic, which was publicized to be the ship that God himself could not sink, and yet that was never finished, never made a complete voyage. And then Richard Nixon, about putting a man on the moon when he knew they weren't there, simply to sound realistic, said it was the greatest event since creation itself.
Oh, wow, I never even knew he said that.
Yeah, and so here think about it, the greatest event of mankind is putting a man on the moon. Just like the greatest event in biblical times was the Tower of Babel. But the Tower of Babel was never finished. And the Titanic never made one voyage after it was boasted to be unsinkable by God himself. And now we know the same is true of Apollo. The greatest event, the greatest claim of mankind actually never happened as well. It's a lie. And that's why I think this is a little bit different than 9/11, JFK. All those things are really lies. But this one is the most grandiose, in-your-face, lying through your teeth, deliberately, lie. It's not like, well, we want these people dead or we got to come up with some scenario as to why to cover it up. In this particular case, the whole endeavor was a lie, deliberate simply to deceive people about one thing. That's why I think it'd be so profound, so important, so beneficial to mankind for the truth to come out. I mean, would you want to know if you had cancer, or would you want to be lied to? And even though popping, maybe a blister or a cancerous growth might be gross, there's relief once it's done. If you ignore it, the cancer is just going to grow and grow and grow, and America will be ruined. But if you admit it, that it's fake, you dissect it out, and maybe, heck, try to go to the moon for real. Who knows? Then the country will heal. But if the truth isn't told about this, the country is just going to die a cancerous death.
I want. There's a Chuck here, or Chuck. Hey, there's a Chuck here, and that's my co-host.
I'm here. I'm right here. Yeah, you're looking right at me.
That actually brings us right back around to another question we wanted to ask you. But it kind of seems like that basically for you, as I'm listening to you, and I'm glad that I'm getting this, it seems like to you that the whole issue is a lot bigger than just the lunar landings. Like the newscasters and the stuff that I saw on Google just wanted to make you out to be this crazy guy that has this crazy theory and blah, blah, blah. But as I'm listening to you, it seems like the passion more is directed towards that, hey, this is not just about the lunar landings. This is about honesty. This is about bringing our country back to a foundation of truth. And if we just let this sit and we never expose it, then it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Would you think that that would be a fair deduction?
Yeah, I would. If you would, please just put the link I just sent you in the Skype notes there. Put that link atop of this interview and have people encouraged to watch or to read this article and to watch the links therein before listening to the podcast so they know where I'm coming from. I mean, the first 25% of this 15,000 word article is all about lies. You know, what is a lie? Why is our world defending lies? See, the battle between good and evil, as I explain, isn't as important as the battle between truth and lies, because they precede good and evil. And so when you're going to do an evil deed, you have to construct a lie first to cover it up. And a lie is also the only sin or misdeed that you can't really put your hand on. You know, if I steal your flat screen, there's that blank space on your wall and there's that TV in my new home, right? Or if I kill your brother, there's his corpse and his widow and orphan kids. But if I tell a lie, where is it? I mean, how many people are in jail for lying? No, they're in there for killing and stealing, right?
Right.
And so lie is the number one misdeed of corrupt people that they get away with the most.
Right.
They can only kill so many people before they get caught. They can only steal so much before they get caught. But they can continue to lie and lie and lie, and that's really the number one evil of the world that's alive today and doing well. It's more than murder, it's more than war, it's lying. And in fact, that was the sin that caused the earth to fall. It wasn't murder, it wasn't adultery, it wasn't theft. The first sin on planet Earth was done by Satan, and it was a lie. And it was because of a lie, not a murder, not a theft, that the world fell. And that's the same reason it remains fallen today, is simply because of lies. And what is John 3:16? Everyone quotes that, John 3:16. But believe and you'll be saved. But they don't read the next two verses, which is, but here's the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men love darkness instead of light, because their deeds were dark, and will not come into the light for fear their deeds will be exposed.
That's really good. And that article, I actually did read that article that you sent me over email, and actually Chuck's got a quote from Carl Berenstain that actually comes from that article. Go ahead, Chuck.
You're talking about the book, right?
Yes.
Oh, it says that more than 400 American journalists that we know of have secretly carried out assignments for the Central Intelligence Agency, according to the documents on file at CIA headquarters. In many instances, CIA documents show that journalists were contracted to perform covert missions for the CIA with the consent of the managers of America's leading news organizations. Among the executives that we know of who lent their cooperation to the CIA were the heads of Time Magazine, Newsweek, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, the Big Three, the Associated Press, United Press International, and Reuters.
Yeah, and that's pretty much everybody. And this is in the 70s. And as you know, when Reagan came along, he deregulated media even more. It used to be you could only own one TV station and one newspaper, and that's it. Now you can own as many as you want. So you have these people who are running Washington, D.C., running the corruption there, and they are protecting their misdeeds through propaganda that misdirects the attention of the public in other ways. And if that was going on 40 years ago, which is when he wrote this, think how much more it is going on today. So the way that people believed that the moon missions were real were through ABC, NBC, and CBS. You see, it was them. It was through them that people believed the lie that the moon missions were real when they were not. So they are liable for propagating that lie, intentionally or otherwise. Some believe intentionally. Some believe Walter Cronkite knew that the moon missions were fake, that he was in on it, and played right along with it.
So if I surmise correctly, then the CIA would have been integrally involved in the faking of the lunar landings, which would have been both faked to the American people and would have been a fraud for the rest of the world to look on.
That's right, definitely. Somebody was on that third channel of audio telling Neil Armstrong, whoa, don't answer the question immediately. Wait until 4 seconds to go by to give this fake appearance that you're further away from Earth than you really are. That was probably the CIA.
And that's just crazy to even think about, that they went to that extent just to fake this whole thing. And really, if I'm not correct, the whole purpose behind the faking of the lunar landings, as you have stated, is basically to get Russia to stop trying. It was basically, like you said in the beginning of the show, it was we had twos in our hands and they had aces in their pocket, and we bluffed the heck out of them.
Well, yeah, actually, but prior to actually doing it, the objective was to bankrupt them because they didn't have a capitalistic economy. Their economy was more fragile and more propped up by the government than ours was. So if both nations invested heavily in reaching the moon through attrition, financial attrition, the Soviet Union would have been bankrupt first. And therefore, they would have won a great milestone of bankrupting them in their attempt to go to the moon. So, and additionally, they were sucking off this money, which they weren't spending on moon projects, and could spend it elsewhere. Congress said, you can spend money on war in Vietnam, but nowhere else. Not in Laos, not in Cambodia, and not in the other surrounding countries, Thailand or wherever they were. And of course, many soldiers admitted to the fact that they were illegally operating in these countries, not approved by Congress, with money that was probably coming from the NASA budgets.
I think actually I might have heard you say that on another interview. It was the whole goal was to bankrupt Russia, which is, something a lot of people don't even really think of. They don't think about the monetary need to actually run a space program and actually get people, quote unquote, to the moon. And so that's actually a really good point that you bring up that I hadn't actually considered in a while. So we're going to start wrapping this interview up, and but there's a few questions that I want to ask you, and these are well, I'll just go ahead and read this off. I want to ask you some difficult questions, and I need you to understand that as I'm asking them, I'm only asking them because, just like you've been talking about truth and the need for truth and all that, honestly, I'm asking them. My heart is as a brother in the Lord, and just questions to consider that I feel like they need to be asked. They're in no way antagonistic to you. I have the utmost respect for you, and they're not antagonistic to what you believe. They're not designed to debunk you or to cause bitter frustration. I'm only asking them because I believe they are a necessity, and I would like your thoughts, and that's the honest truth. So Chuck and I are going to kind of trade back and forth. It's only 4 of them, but it was some questions I had when I was watching specifically the video Astronauts Gone Wild. I actually thought that the content on a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, as well as the article that I had checked out, I thought those were very well done and very well researched. It was really only the Astronauts Gone Wild video that I had a couple of questions about, and it was questions that just popped into my mind as I was watching them. So if you don't want me to ask them, we can go ahead and end it here.
No, sorry.
But I only give that big long preface because they're tough, but I just need you to know that they're not antagonistic in any way. So
you don't need to even preface them. You can just ask questions. It doesn't matter.
Okay, well, I've never actually interviewed you, so I just wanted to let you know that in advance. So I was watching a movie. I already said all that. Then I was watching Astronauts Gone Wild, and while I understand your point that if the astronauts in question had really gone to the moon, they would have no problem swearing on the Bible, I have a hard time with the ways that the interviews themselves were done. I want to know, how do you justify posing as a reporter for certain organizations to get interviews from these astronauts that they would not give otherwise? Wouldn't that make you you were using the word liar, so I use it loosely. But wouldn't that make you just as much of as a liar as these astronauts? I know you're a Christian, so we both know that to God there is no difference between a big lie and a little lie. So I was just kind of curious as to what you were thinking when you were going about those particular interviews.
Well, certainly if I say I want to conduct an interview with you about why I believe the moon landings are fake, they would not have granted the interviews. So what I did is I simply said, I'm doing a documentary about the moon landings. That's it. They assumed that it was going to be, as every other interview they've had their entire lives, I'm sure, was going to be one favorable with the point of view that people would be gaga over them as heroes rather than the criminals that they were. So I don't recall lying other than giving them a half-truth, which was I'm doing a documentary about the moon missions. It was their false assumption to believe that it would be positive. So
I actually, and the only reason why I used that term was because I believe one of the, or maybe actually it was two of them that were under the assumption that you were doing it for a child charity, for a children's orphanage charity. I think
no, that's not true in the slightest. In fact, that's the first time I've ever heard that. I've read things about me on the internet that are just so mind-bogglingly preposterous and stupid. It's just, like I staged being punched. That's one thing I've heard. That I've run around out in public without any clothes on. I've heard that one. And this is the first one that I've heard that I was, doing this for some children's. I never said anything like that. People are lying in order to prove their point, which means that their point isn't valid to begin with. I had one detractor who runs a website. I forget the name of it, but he's like the leading, we really went to the moon, don't listen to Bart guy. And he said, I only worked at NBC for 2 months. Well, I worked there for 2 years. I worked there through 2 Christmases and 2 Thanksgivings. I know how long I worked there. So he's lying about how long I worked there. And if the guy has to lie to prove his point, that means his point is not valid. Otherwise, the truth would speak for itself, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually glad to hear that. I thought that I was on the actual movie itself where the astronaut was saying, I thought you were doing this for some children's charity orphanage thing. And it was actually one of the astronauts.
Now, you have a very faulty memory. You're either drinking some wine, sabbatical wine, or didn't get enough sleep that night when you watched it. No, believe me, I was there. The only ones that are on camera that I can remember is one guy thought I was with ABC News when in fact I was with ABC Digital, which was the name of my company. Okay. He misunderstood that. I have a business card said ABC Digital. I call up people. I say this is Bart with ABC Digital. Said it 1,000 times. Okay. Now if they mistook that for ABC News, that's a mistake on their part. No misrepresentation on my part.
Okay. Well, my apologies on that, and thank you for clearing that up. I guess I completely misunderstood, and I'm actually glad that I did.
People can say anything they want about me on the internet, and the more that they lie about me on the internet, the more it proves that I'm right.
Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah. The next question is that you are famous for getting punched in the face by Buzz Aldrin. But I went and watched the interview, and you were calling him a liar and a coward. How do you not think that you deserved getting punched in the face by him when you were calling him names?
Well, I wouldn't call it names. Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs because they were whitewashed tombs. They were hypocrites. The fact is a fact. He is a liar. He's a liar for saying he walked on the moon when he didn't.
Sure.
He's a coward because he's afraid to tell the truth. Anyone who's afraid of words is a coward. And he's a thief because we just paid him $2,000 an hour to give us an interview about something he completely made up. So he stole the money. We were there, at least the Japanese portion of our company was there to get an interview about a guy who walked on the moon. He stole that money because he never walked on the moon. So he was a liar, a coward, and a thief. That's a fact. Now, whether or not that's an appropriate thing to say or not, maybe that's a better point. I certainly didn't wake up that morning saying, hey, I can't wait to call Buzz a liar, a coward, and a thief. And I'm sure he didn't wake up that morning saying, I can't wait to punch that Bart Sibrel in the mouth. It is one of those things that happened. I can tell you that I later apologized to him for speaking to him disrespectfully. It was shown to me in the Bible that it says to rebuke an older man respectfully. And I would say that that was done in a disrespectful way. Even though he is a liar, a coward, and a thief, maybe that's not the best way of going about helping him to be converted, But again, I apologize for it. And the very day I apologized, he ordered a copy of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, And we since have reconciled our differences, and he knows that I know he lied about it, and he's got more believers on his side than my side, so he's not really worried about it. The fact is, if he really walked on the moon, me saying otherwise would be like throwing a feather at him. Why would anyone be mad if I threw a feather at them? But the fact is, it was like going up to him in front of his wife and saying, oh, how's your mistress doing? I just saw her the other day. And then if you expose a truth that he's been, sweeping under the rug, that's what makes him angry. But people can see that, for themselves in the film.
I'm actually very, that's actually really awesome that the humility that you've had and, being able to say, hey, you know what, I could have gone about that better. So that's actually really cool. I can respect that a lot, actually.
Definitely.
Well, I'm not even sure I would make Astronauts Gone Wild again today. You probably get uncomfortable watching it. Do you?
I do, and that's the only reason I was like, man, Lord, I really don't want to ask these questions.
Let me tell you something, guys. I get uncomfortable watching it.
Oh, well, that's awesome, man.
I don't know if you ever saw this film with Robert De Niro. There's a film called King of Comedy. It's funny film he did. One of the few comedies Robert De Niro ever did. Anyway, he's being kicked out of this office by security. For wanting to wait over the weekend to see the person he was going to see. He's like, well, I'll sit here in the waiting room until Monday. It's a Friday. They're like, pick up your bag. You need to go. I'm sweating watching it, I'm so embarrassed for him just looking at it. And, that's how I get watching it. I'm like, I'm amazed myself. I did it and it all happened. But, that's I was doing the best I could at that time. The film came out, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, and then a couple of years go by, and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool? Because I see, TV courtroom dramas. Why don't we just ask them to swear on the Bible, whether they walked on the moon or not? I've had other Christians point out, well, you shouldn't ask people to take an oath. I think Jesus said that a couple of times in the Gospels, and it's said in the book of James, don't take an oath. That's associated with secret societies and things like that. There's validity perhaps to that. So again, I'm not sure I would make it. I get some negative comments on Astronauts Gone Wild, but I get surprisingly positive comments about it too. Good thing. And it's like if O.J. Simpson really killed those people he got acquitted of, and if he killed them, then he deserves to be we could say hounded or questioned about it by the media. Right?
Yeah.
And these guys have embezzled millions of dollars and are deceiving scientists, deceiving school children, deceiving aerospace engineers, deceiving college professors and college students, Congress and the Senate. They didn't vote on faking the moon landing. Then they deserve a little bit of being under the spotlight, really, if you think about it. And I think, that's why Jesus called liars, liars. That's it. I admit it. I've been a liar. I've been a coward. I've been a thief myself. So there you go. But again, that was just what I thought of at the time, and I'm not even sure I would make it again. Who knows?
For sure. And that I'm really glad you said all that. Just coming from your point of view, so that listeners and other people can actually hear that come from your own mouth. That's really cool, I think. Another concern of mine, and since we're talking about all that, and I only bring it up because I believe, and I honestly really do only bring this up because I believe you have some valid points about the lunar landings, and I feel this issue might keep you from being as effective as you want to be, is do you believe the way that you went about these interviews and doing this movie might keep people from seeing you as seriously as they should be taking you?
Well, I think it's kind of like this last election. I think the vast majority of people had their mind made up a year ago. If Hillary is their hero, there's nothing you could say to not make her so. And if Trump is your hero, there's nothing you could say to not make it so. I think the same is probably the case with the moon missions. Most people have seen if anything happened on the way to the moon first, hopefully. I can understand if people see astronauts gone wild first. They can find that offensive without knowing the meticulous work that I've done to prove beforehand that the missions were indeed fake. And now we're going to take that information and confront them. So, if they're seen in reverse order, maybe people get offended by that. Some people say it's good for the historical record because the truth will come out that these missions are fake. And maybe one or two of these guys will still be alive. Maybe they'll all be dead when that happened. And they were given the opportunity to come clean, and they did not take advantage of that. I mean, we have Edgar Mitchell, who had this reputation of being this peace guru. And then he says, I don't hit people. And 5 seconds later, he hits me from behind. He can't even go 5 seconds without telling a lie. And he goes about being some pacifist and says, I don't hit people. And then when your back is turned to him 5 seconds later, he hits you. And then when we accidentally leave a wireless microphone on him and the camera in the back seat of the rental car is still recording, we hear him and his son talk about calling the CIA to have me executed. And this is the guy who claims to be some, peace guru hero. This is a guy that people worship. And why would, if they really went to the moon, why would he call the CIA to kill a journalist who thinks they didn't go to the moon? I mean, does anyone think that's a little strange? And then the same guy, Edgar Mitchell, who says he walked on the moon when he did not, says aliens are real. And he keeps telling everybody aliens are real, aliens are real. And, of course, the moon landings are real. So what does that tell you about aliens? They're not real. Last time I was in a hotel, bored, I flipped through HBO. 3 of the 10 movies on are about aliens from outer space. Now, if 3 of the 10 movies on were about how great Trump is, or 3 of the movies on were about how terrible Trump is, wouldn't you think somebody was trying to get your mind, going down a particular direction? And all these movies about aliens, and the same liar who says he walked on the moon when he didn't says aliens are real, which means, of course, they're not. I think it's very simple. The longer I live, even by the day, I'm sitting right here last night at this hour, 24 hours ago, and I'm thinking, the Bible is real. Adam and Eve are real. Revelation is real. God is real. Jesus is real. It's so simple if we simply take God at his word. And then you have these complicated scoundrels who tell lies about everything from pedophilia to embezzling money, to go from one, black project to another, from aliens and all this stuff. And it's really just fallen angels. A third of millions of angels, a third of millions, however many that is, were cast down to the earth. And here they are in the unseen realms, hidden realms that these own UFO researchers, the top in their field, say that's where they are. They're here on the earth, hidden in the ocean or hidden in other dimensions. And that's what's going on. That's what all this lie is about. And the same guy who propagates the greatest lie of all time, landing on the moon, is saying that aliens are real. And he wants us to believe it so badly, which means it's not real. You can put money on that one.
For sure. Go ahead, Chuck.
And you also bring up repeatedly that the astronauts contradict each other in their interviews. And I think that is a legitimate question. However, it has been 50 plus, 47 years, I guess, right? Years since the lunar landings, since Apollo 11 started, all that. And anyone investigating a crime scene knows that details between witnesses will tend to be contradicted at some points. They also know that the longer you wait to get witness testimony, the more difficult it will be to get a good, cohesive witness testimony. How is the astronaut's testimony any different from this?
Well, it's quite a bit different if they really went to the moon. That's a once in a lifetime duplicated, unique event. I mean, if you look at the first press conference of Apollo 11, if you look at it closely, between each astronaut recessed into the desk is a teleprompter. Okay? Now, they're the only 3 people on the planet who have gone to the moon, and yet they are being prompted on how to answer questions about that one-of-a-kind experience. That's pretty unique, don't you think? They're the only ones on the moon, on the whole planet, and yet they have to look down at a teleprompter to answer questions about what it felt like and what it looked like. And then you have one astronaut who says, when sending to the moon, I think that'd be a moment you would remember. I mean, you're probably coming close to dying. You know, I think you probably remember that burned into your memory. And one guy says when he was descending to the moon, the engine was very loud, as it should be. And then another guy says, well, it was very quiet. And in fact, if you listen to the recordings of them descending to the moon, there's no engine noise whatsoever, because the guys were orbiting the Earth and doing it like a live radio play. They were doing, the audio live and the video was on playback. So that's why there was no noise. So one astronaut says the engine was very loud descending to the moon. The other guy says you couldn't hear it at all.
Yeah, that's
quite a bit different from one another. You know what I mean? That's like one saying there were trees on the moon, and the other guy saying there were no trees at all. I think that's a pretty big difference there.
Yeah,
for sure.
And speaking of trees on the moon, it came out about 5 years ago. Some museum curator in the Netherlands watched my movie. Funny thing happened on the way to the moon, was convinced that the moon missions were fake. He had in his possession, this hermetically sealed alleged moon rock that Neil Armstrong allegedly personally picked up off the moon surface and gave it to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And he opens it up out of this hermetically sealed box that everyone presumed would never be opened, put it under a microscope, and it's a piece of petrified wood.
No way. That really happened?
Wow.
It's linked to it at the end of this article that I just sent you a link to under references. NASA says no comment. Yeah, that's right. It's a good one. No comment. Yeah, right. Okay. Because Neil Armstrong personally picked up this rock, personally gave it to the Netherlands, and it's a piece of petrified wood. Now, that means the moon rocks are fake. Hello? How come a journalist doesn't ask the question, well, if the moon rocks are fake, what about the moon missions? Then Neil Armstrong told everybody for 50 years practically that he left this list of equipment on the moon, which he was supposed to do because it didn't have, there wasn't weight capacity to lift off the moon, because the part that landed and the part that lifted off were 2 separate parts. It was like a 2-piece spacecraft, if you can believe it. The thing that landed on the moon had 2 parts to it. And the very top part was the only part that actually allegedly flew up and synchronized with something going 4,000 miles an hour. And if they were more than 1/10 of a second off in synchronizing, they would have been lost in space. Of course, that worked flawlessly every time, even though their computers were, 1/1,000,000th as accurate as they are today. And in any case, he said he left this, equipment, a sample bag, the tongs to pick up stuff, and a camera or something, that he just removed the film of and left the camera because they needed every ounce of weight, shaved off. He told everybody this, list of equipment was left on the moon. Well, after the guy dies, his widow finds the equipment in his bedroom closet.
What?
Yeah, like 20 pounds worth of equipment that they allegedly didn't have the weight to lift off. So he told everybody his entire life that he left this stuff on the moon, and the stuff's in his closet. That makes the news, and yet no one says, well, if he left it on the moon and he has it in his closet, what's going on here? Unless the moon and the Earth are the same place where they were filmed, you see? It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of our interview here. And before we go, is there anything else that you want to go ahead and add to this interview before we let you go, Mr. Sibrel?
I would just encourage people to read this link that I sent you in the Skype notes here.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes.
I spent 1,000 to 2,000 hours writing this article. It's about a third as long as a book, and it has video links in it. It has great references at the end. It's concrete proof that the moon missions were fake. You just have to be a truth seeker. Anyone who's become a Christian, they had to admit that they were wrong, right?
Right.
They had to repent. They had to at some point say, the way I've lived my life is in error, and I'm going to be born again, and I'm going to start living in a different way. That person, you could call it humility, the willingness to admit that they're wrong. Pride is simply the unwillingness to admit that they're wrong. That's the college professor I told you about. If he said Buzz Aldrin confessed on national TV the missions were fake, he said, I still believe they were real. And that's all. You have to simply be a seeker of the truth. And the truth is, unless we repent of our sins and make Jesus Lord of our life, we will not have eternal life. And you can believe in God, but James, in the book of James, it says even the demons believe. So intellectual belief in God is not salvation. And once you are genuinely saved, Jesus says the love of most will grow cold. And only he of the saved who holds to the very end will be truly saved. You see?
Right.
That's the most important thing. And if, showing the depravity of mankind and the degree to which they are fallen, which the moon landings represents, I think that's a good thing.
Well, that's awesome. And that is our altar call today, guys. Thank you for that, Mr. Sibrel. And thank you for your time. And we will actually, for everybody listening, we will have that article up on our website. We also have it in our show notes for you guys to access, along with Mr. Sibrel's bio and the materials that you can find on YouTube as well as other places. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon, as well as all the other things we've been talking about on this show. And that's it for our interview with Bart Sibrel. You guys have a good night. We will be back next Sunday with Pete Greer as he discusses the 7 ways that creation science defies evolution. Thank you for listening to Devil's Been Talking Radio, and don't forget to stop and ask yourself, who are you listening to? Have a good night, Mr. Sibrel, and we really appreciate your time.
That's a success with your program.
Thank you. I appreciate you, man. Bye.
No problemo. Take care.
Yep, you too, man.
Both in 2004, Apollo 11, Monkey Business, False Photography Unedited, and Apollo 11 Post-Flight Press Conference. All of you listening to Devil's Been Talking Radio, please welcome Bart Sibrel.
Woo!
Well, I don't think that after that lengthy introduction, there's not much time to talk. Only about a half minute, right?
Right.
The funny thing is, Mr. Sibrel, I went on. I think there's an extreme internet bias against you, because I went online forever looking for all sorts of stuff to just to find out more about you, to tell our listeners, and there was nothing, like absolutely nothing. And I found this actually on your website, and it was the best introduction I could get, because all the stuff on there was just all negative press and stuff like that. And I was like, man, I mean, come on, there's got to be something here that I can use that's actually valid, as opposed to, everybody, they would, oh man, this guy totally thinks we didn't go to the moon, and here how he's wrong, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, there was absolutely nothing on Google. I mean, nothing. I was actually very surprised.
Well, we live in a time where lies are believed to be the truth, and the truth is believed to be a lie. And unfortunately, that's the state of the world. We have people complaining about fake news who themselves are more expert at fake news than anybody else. So it's really remarkable. And in regard to the moon landings, it's probably the only conspiracy done which really was positive. I mean, whoever shot JFK, whether it was the Russians or Oswald or the CIA, he's still dead. And whoever did 9/11, whether it was the Saudis or the Iraqis or Cheney, 3,000 people are still dead.
Right.
And the moon landings, though, is a positive lie. It made everyone feel good. And, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, we're playing Pittsburgh. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know you were on the team. It's like, oh, well, not we, but yeah, that's the way that people think. We are playing in the Super Bowl, even though they're not on the field, they're not in the stadium, they're at home. But somehow they're playing in the Super Bowl, and even though one single member is not even from their own state, which is what the team is named after. And so people said, we went to the moon, and so you're trying to take that away from them as if you're telling them their team that won the Super Bowl did so by cheating. Even if it's true, they don't want to know about it. It's very simple. If it were possible to go to the moon with 1960s technology, you have to understand a smartphone has 1 million times the computing power than all of NASA had when they allegedly went to the moon. So if they could go to the moon with 1960s technology, which is 1 millionth as sophisticated as a smartphone, if they could do that on their first attempt with 5 decades older technology, there would be bases there by now. Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927. If I said, well, 50 years later, no one has still duplicated that event of flying over the Atlantic since 1927, that would be illogical. There are millions and millions of aircraft built, and millions and hundreds of millions of times they've flown over the Atlantic since then. So to say they could go to the moon on the very first attempt with 1960s technology, but it cannot be repeated today, simply defies logic. And even though it defies logic, people's emotions are tied into this. I talked to a professor at a university, and I asked him if he saw Buzz Aldrin confess on national TV that the moon landings were fake, would he then accept it? And he says, no, I would still think that they went.
Yeah, that's insanity.
Isn't that amazing? And this guy is a professor teaching college at a major university, and he says he would disregard the person who was there at the time and still believe that they went anyway. Isn't that amazing? And that's what we're up against. So no wonder why when someone, tells the truth that people don't want to hear, they're persecuted. This has been going on for thousands of years. That's why they say kill the messenger. It's this latest thing going on is that the Russians helped Trump win. Well, even if they did, the only way that they did it was by leaking out facts about Hillary Clinton. You see what I'm saying? So what they're really saying is the truth helped Trump win the election, which means it was Hillary Clinton's disreputable behavior and the DNC's disreputable behavior that helped Trump win the election. They blame it on the Russians, but even if the Russians released the information through Assange, through WikiLeaks, all that's in the information is simply the truth. So what the current administration is saying is we do not want the truth to be known, otherwise it might influence the election in a way where honest people might accidentally win.
Yeah, as you said, we're in a society now where people, they don't want to hear, they're so committed to something that anything opposed to that point of view is going to be completely persecuted just because of the fact that's something they don't want to hear. And then, of course, they want to whenever the truth comes out about a particular candidate or just whatever in general, if it's to their benefit, then it's pretty convenient. And then that's when they want to accept it and use it for their own bias. So I wanted to ask you a question just because of the fact that I've heard you on a couple of different podcasts. And so it was just questions of interest to me. But I wanted to ask you, just so that our audience can get to know you a little better, when did you decide that the lunar landings were fake, and what started you on this journey towards exposing the whole hoax of the lunar landings themselves?
Well, I used to think they were real. In fact, I was the biggest fan of the moon missions that I knew. I had about 20 pictures, color pictures, on my wall from the age of 4 to 14. No matter where I moved, there they were on my wall. I was the biggest fan. I thought it was the greatest thing, marvelous, magical, whatever. And then when I was 14 years old, I saw on a national television program a gentleman who worked for NASA during the time of Apollo who said he read an interdepartmental memo that said the odds of them reaching the moon without killing the crew and returning them safely was estimated to be 1 in 10,000.
Wait, what year was this? What year was this that you heard that?
I believe that would have been 69, 79. I guess it would have been about 1985, something like that, maybe a little bit before, maybe 1980. something like that.
So this whole idea isn't like a new thing then.
Well, it's fairly new in that I spent a good portion of my life believing that the moon landings are real. So when I basically just started pondering about the moon landings potentially being false around the age of 14. Then when I was 24, 10 years later, after at least entertaining the idea that they might be false, I had become a filmmaker and was working on a film for the gentleman who had produced a TV show I'd seen 10 years earlier as a 14-year-old. And I asked him, well, who was that guy who said we didn't go to the moon? And I tracked him down, and he suggested that I do a film about it. And I took about 6 months off, did research into the photography anomalies. There's several that are pretty noticeable. I mean, if these pictures that they claim were lit by sunlight on the moon, as there's no atmosphere there, so according to NASA, the sunlight is 10 times brighter than a desert on Earth, there's no need for electrical lighting when you have such bright lighting. And yet, in several of the pictures, the astronaut shadows, let's say from one astronaut to another, or from an astronaut to a rock or whatever, they run in divergent angles. They're not parallel. I mean, if you go out with your friend and stand on a sunny, cloudless day out in the yard, you'll see that your shadows will always run parallel with one another. They will never intersect. And in some of these pictures, and you can see this, just your listeners can go to Sibrel, Sibrel.com, and then click on the YouTube link and then go down to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. They can see the film in which there's objects about 3 feet apart from one another where the shadows are going at 90 degrees different angle. This is simply impossible to be done with sunlight. It means that this was being shot with an electrical light that was...
For all of our listeners, we have Bart Sibrel on. He's produced a couple of films that Chuck's going to name off in a second, but he's calling in, and we're going to go ahead and talk to him about all his beliefs and theories on the lunar landings and what really happened there. And go ahead and read that off, Chuck.
And we're talking about the black
Yes.
area again. And Mr. Sibrel, thank you for being with us as well. My name is Chuck. And we have Bart Sibrel, of course, like we mentioned here, and he is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and investigative journalist who has been producing movies and television programs for 30 years. During this time, he has owned 5 production companies, been employed by 2 of the 3 major networks, and produced films shown on ABC, NBC, CNN, TLC, USA, BET, as well as The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. To discuss these films, he has appeared and been interviewed on The Daily Show, Geraldo, NBC, CNN, Fox, Tech TV, and from Coast to Coast. I guess that's...
Coast to Coast AM.
Okay, forgive me there. And the Abrams Report. Articles featuring Mr. Sibrel's films have been published in Time Magazine, USA Today, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and many others. His top awards from the American Motion Pictures Society include Best Cinematography, Best Editing, and Top 10 Director. Mr. Sibrel has also taught about 20 workshops on acting, filmmaking, editing, and writing, privately and for the Screen Actors Guild. In his youth, he brought to the stage several original theatrical productions, hosted a cable television talk show, and appeared as a seasoned actor on the stage himself over 500 times. And Bart Sibrel's films that bring the validity of the landings in dispute are as follows. In 2000, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. 2001, Astronauts Gone Wild, an investigation into the authenticity of the moon landing.